Oh, thank you for your.
Okay. I'll stand here so anybody online can see me for a moment too. Do we have any other visitors or new members or guests? Yes.
New member again, Matthew K. Potts. I joined a few years ago, slacked off during COVID, and I'm back again.
Well, we're glad to have you back. We know how that went too. So anyway, great. Well, let me do a quick introduction of our guest speaker. And thanks to Linda for hooking us up. We have Luis Torres, and he is born and raised in South Florida. And if I've mispronounced your name, I'm sorry. I'm born and raised in South Florida, grew to have a strong appreciation for both the modern and ancient natural world. In fact, during his exploration of the modern, he found some curious chalky seashells, which he later learned were the fossilized remains of snails and clams. Such a discovery, it lit a fire of curiosity within him, and soon he developed a love for all things paleontology, invertebrate or otherwise. In the further pursuit of knowledge, he attended Florida Atlantic University in 2014, obtaining a Bachelor of Science degree in biology shortly after in 2018. Following this, by working as a docent at the Palm Beach Museum of Natural History and as an FAU lab technician for a few years, holding himself over while working towards a Master's of Science degree in Geological Sciences at FAU, finishing in the summer of 2022. Not long after, he was accepted into a PhD program at the University of Florida, Florida Museum of Natural History in order to study conservation paleobiology, a subfield of paleontology that uses the fossil record to establish pre-human conditions of ecosystems, which can act as a benchmark for conservation efforts. Now, only a couple of years from obtaining a PhD, he still makes sure to remain active in science communication, using what he's learned over the years and in a natural talkative nature to teach the public about various paleontological topics. So, without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Luis Torres.
Awesome. Thank you, Ms. Terry. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate you guys having me here. And your pronunciation was excellent. It's Luis Torres.
Oh, good.
And so, yeah, like I said, thank you guys for inviting me. As you guys, heard, this is a little bit of a far cry from what I typically do doing my research, right? Most of the time, I take a look at the invertebrate fossil record on the seafloor. I'm a scuba diver, so that's how I go ahead and grab my fossils of these ancient seashells. But for a couple of years during my master's degree, as was mentioned, I worked as a docent for the Palm Beach Museum of Natural History, where I gave tours and talked to people for hours on end about some of the most popular charismatic megafauna. And among these, some of my favorites were, of course, the terror birds. Now, a terror bird is technically just a sort of a popular name for a group or a family of large predatory flightless birds known as Forest Rockidae. We have about 20 different species that all range in sizes from around 2.5 feet tall to almost 10 feet tall, and being around 11 pounds all the way up to 770 pounds. And these guys were pretty restricted in terms of their continental range, mostly dominating South America from around 30 to 3 million years ago. Now, of course, their temporal range did extend beyond this, right? I believe that one of the first terror birds that we have fossil evidence for ranges, as far back as 43 million years ago. And the last terror bird was believed to go extinct around 97,000 years ago, at the end of the not the end of the late Pleistocene, but into the late Pleistocene. But before these times, or during these times, they were sort of reduced in terms of their biodiversity. The 30 to 3 million year mark was really where they were super dominant in their environment. And what makes these birds rather unique compared to other large flightless birds like, say, paleonates, like ostriches and emus, is that they have a proportionally really, really large head, right? I affectionately like to call them bobblehead birds, right? Because they have skulls that, compared to the rest of their body, are just absolutely massive. And it's thought that this large skull combined with this, incredibly sharp beak is partially what made them such effective predators, given that they also have incredibly powerful legs, which not only make them really good at running, with some species thought to run up to 60 miles an hour, but they can also sort of give out some devastating kicks. I believe there was one study where, one species was thought to be able to produce a force with a single kick that was 3.5 times its own body weight, right? So just an incredible group of animals that I absolutely love talking about. So I'm happy that this is what we chose for our discussion today. Now, terror birds are completely extinct, but they do have cousins that are still around today in the form of Seriamus. And so Forest Rockidae is, as I said, a family. But if you take one step back, you sort of broaden the taxonomic scope a little bit, right? The order that Forest Rockidae belongs to is the Caryamiformes. And Seriamus, while not being terror birds in themselves, are sort of this are a part of this Caryamiform order. So essentially, while they're not within a direct family, they are close cousins. And there's really, even with these guys, their diversity isn't fantastic. They only really have 2 species that are around today, the red-legged Seriama and the black-legged Seriama, with the red-legged Seriama being, not only larger, but just having a much broader range and being more common overall. And so you can find both of these species in the plains of South America. So when you think about the, where you have different habitats in different parts of the continent, you of course have the Amazon more in the northern regions. The western region, the western coast of South America is mostly mountainous. So, most of the plains are going to be in the eastern, southeastern section of South America. And that's where you can find these sort of animals. And for a bird, they're relatively large, right? So we're talking around 2.5 feet tall, weighing around 5 pounds max, which is around the same height as a bald eagle, but being about half the weight. Okay, and that's because these guys are very gracile, they're very sort of lean, they're not terribly dense, and this is because, well, they have much smaller wings compared to a bald eagle, and so they are able to fly. But in order to do so, in order to have these small wings and being able to fly in the first place, they have to be relatively lightly built. Okay, and so. But they are mostly going to be terrestrial ground-dwelling birds. And just like their cousins, the terror birds, and funny enough, bald eagles, they are primarily carnivorous. So they're mostly eating things like snakes, rodents, lizards, stuff like that. And if you actually see a Seriaman in the zoo, a lot of the times what they do for enrichment is they allow these animals to display a sort of predatory behavior they do with a lot of reptiles, especially because, if you're a snake hunter, last thing you want is to be bitten by a snake, right? And so they seem to have developed this behavior that minimizes this risk, where they'll essentially grab a snake, even the rubber one, as you see here, by the tail and sort of lift it up, really as high as they can, and then swiftly just slam it into the ground, sort of whipping the body of the snake, and sometimes they'll even throw them into things like rocks and stuff like that. And this is thought to, if not outright kill the snake, at least paralyze it so they can go ahead and then just tear it apart at their leisure. But another sort of adaptation, at least a physical one that Seriamus also have, is very reminiscent of the non-avian dromaeosaur dinosaurs, or the raptor kind of dinosaurs. And while these guys, all birds are dinosaurs, right? Because they're descended directly from dinosaurs. And so it's thought that they sort of developed this adaptation with their feet similar to some of their ancestors, the raptors, in which they have 2 toes. Their outer 2 toes are weight bearing, but then they have an innermost toe, in which is kept mostly off the ground so it can support this large recurved claw without it dragging along the ground and getting dulled. And just like their ancestor raptor dinosaurs, they're thought to use this claw in a very similar way as sort of a meat hook. So, their prey items are pretty squirmy, right? They're hard to really, hold on to. And so this hook is thought to allow them to sort of pierce into the body of something like a lizard or a rodent. And then it would really be a hard time for, whatever prey animal they have a hold of to get away. And so it's thought that, the dromaeosaur dinosaurs use this claw in a similar way, and possibly even terror birds. And in fact, the last time I gave this talk, which was a couple of years ago, this wasn't discovered yet. But in 2013, they actually found some terror bird footprints. This is going to be this one all the way furthest to the right here. Okay, let me see if I can get how do I do I always forget how to do the red light, but regardless, what you see under C here, okay, is that terror terror bird footprint. And that's exactly what is shown with Serraemus, right? Where you have the outer two most toes are weight bearing, and then you have a third toe, right? It's held mostly off the ground, and you even have in this footprint a sort of small indent into the mud that this animal stepped in that's indicative of that recurved claw. And so terror birds, are known to are now understood to have this kind of claw to help with holding down smaller prey items. And then the other footprints you see, A, B, and D, right? Those are all dromaeosaur or raptor dinosaur footprints, just to show the similarities between them and this newly discovered terror bird track. And another sort of implication of this footprint of the terror bird is that ostriches, one of the fastest running types of birds, only have two toes, right? They only have two weight-bearing toes. And it's believed that they have this sort of foot setup where they reduce the third digit to allow them to run much more efficiently. Something about reducing the weight of the foot. And it's thought that in addition to developing this, sort of recurved claw, that this two-digit weight-bearing morphology of terror birds actually improves their efficiency in terms of running and allows them to be more cursorial than otherwise would be, or than otherwise they would be, excuse me. Now, of course, I'm sure some of you have heard of Serraemus, and then I'm sure some of you haven't. And so you might be thinking, great, Luis, awesome. Thank you for telling me that terror birds are closely related to Serraemus. What about some birds that I actually know about, right? How does this tell me where terror birds sit on the whole bird family tree? Because I'm not even sure where Serraemus sit. Well, I developed this small sort of, at least part of the bird family tree here. I would have loved to put every single order of bird, but then it made it absolutely unreadable and very convoluted. And so basically what I have here is just the clade, in which includes the Caryomyforms, which is Serraemus and terror birds, and then their closest living relatives, which, funny enough, are things like falcons, parrots, and then the little Tweety birds, right? So any sort of bird you hear singing outside your window is more closely related to a terror bird than, say, something like a chicken or even like other flightless birds like emus and ostriches, right? You would think that a large flightless bird like a terror bird would be more related to other flightless birds like these ostriches. But ostriches and all them are about as far away on the bird family tree as you can get, right, relative to these terror birds. So that's just an interesting little fact there. And so now I of course mentioned that terror birds sort of dominated South America for that 30 to 3 million year mark, where their biodiversity was really, really good for a singular family, at least a singular vertebrate family, right? Us invertebrate paleontologists know that invertebrates really win the game when it comes to diversity. But regardless, right? The reason why they were only restricted to South America for the grand majority of their reign, there was one species that made it into North America. But we'll talk about that later, okay? But the main reason why they were only restricted to South America in most cases is because South America itself was actually an island similar to Australia from, around 34 to 50 million years ago, all the way up until 3 million years ago, where South America connected to North America. Okay, so it was sort of similar, like I said, to Australia, to where, Australia used to be connected to other continents like Antarctica, South America, and Africa, and even India, which is considered a subcontinent, around 152 million years ago. But after this point, due to things like continental drift, which is just essentially the continents and the oceans sit on plates, which are just big slabs of rock, and underneath them you have magma currents that essentially act like a raft floating on an ocean current, right? This sort of pushes these big slabs of rock around. And so, continents and oceans are always moving and sort of changing their position, albeit at a very, very slow rate relative to a human lifetime. Okay, so over millions and millions of years, South America sort of separated from the rest of the continents. Places like Africa moved closer to Europe and would eventually be connected through, different land masses. And then something like India would actually separate and be on its own, and eventually go and crash into the rest of Asia, forming the Himalayan mountains. whereas things like Australia are still isolated. They still haven't connected to anything. And then Antarctica, of course, would move further south and become an absolute frozen wasteland. And similar to Australia, the isolation that South America withstood really allowed it to develop a rather unique fauna compared to other sorts of continents. You know how Australia has things like koalas and kangaroos and all sorts of other animals that you don't really find on other continents. And this was true of ancient South America before it became sort of connected to North America. And this by no means is all of them, right? I mean, I could talk about the fauna of South America for hours. Okay. I mean, this whole thing could have just been about, the herbivores found in South America. Uh, but, this is just a few of what I feel to be some of the most iconic species that are found during this isolation period for South America. And this, of course, includes terror birds, like you see Paraphysornis here, which is third from the left. And this is a relatively good depiction, right? Because this animal is seeming to be around 6 feet tall, which is, pretty, average size for a large terror bird. But it does seem to be like it skipped a few meals, right? It seems a little bit too emaciated almost. And we know that terror birds, which I'll explain in a little bit, some species were very, very bulky. And Paraphysornis itself actually was sort of like the Arnold Schwarzenegger of terror birds. I mean, it was only like something like 5 to 6 feet tall, but weighed almost 500 pounds. I mean, it was an absolute just beefcake of a bird. But other than that, this depiction's pretty good. It's definitely a little bit of a older artwork. But anyway, getting back to the other sorts of animals, terror birds had to compete with organisms such as Pururosaurus, which is a giant caiman. Which, for those of you who don't know, caimans are relatives of alligators that are still around today in South America. Although they don't get nearly this big, they're mostly, maxing out around 15 feet long. But Pururosaurus was an organism, or a caiman, excuse me, that was the size of a Tyrannosaurus Rex. So we're talking 44 feet long, 6 to 8 tons in weight, just an absolutely massive, massive animal. But in terms of some more direct competition with terror birds, South America did have carnivorous marsupials as well, similar to what we used to see with Australia before, humans went and killed all the carnivorous marsupials. And Thylacosmilus isn't a marsupial itself, but is a close relative of marsupials called Spracodonts. And this particular genus has saber teeth, similar to a lot of the more iconic saber-toothed cats like Smilodon, but is not closely related to a cat at all. In fact, something like a squirrel is more closely related to a saber-toothed cat than Thylacosmilus would be. Thylacosmilus is more closely related to things like the opossums you'd see running around. Okay, except it was rather than just a few pounds, the size of a leopard, so around 150 pounds or so. But another carnivorous competitor of terror birds would, of course, also be the Sebecids, which you're seeing is this smaller crocodile thing, about the fourth one to the left. And Sebecids were sort of another name for them are running crocodiles, right? Instead of the typical crocodile morph or crocodilian morph, rather, that is semi-aquatic and mostly a ambush predator within the water. Sebecids were actually terrestrial predators. They were mostly running around and ambushing prey on land. And for me, that's almost more terrifying because if you want to avoid an alligator or crocodile, you just stay out of the water for the most part. But if you were traveled back in time to around 13 to 20 million years ago, these guys would be walking around just like a dog or a cat would, right? So they're to me very, very scary. But in terms of other sort of the herbivores of the area, you of course have some strange fauna that you don't really see much of anymore, including Macrauchenia, which is this sort of larger camel-like thing with that elephant trunk. It's called a Lithotern, and it looks like a camel, but it's not even closely related to camels. They're more so related to things like rhinos and horses, but they're sort of their own branch that are cousins to those animals. And these guys actually, existed or only went extinct at the very latest of the Ice Age. So sure, they evolved during the Miocene. I believe they evolved around 13 or something million years ago, but they would go and last up until around 20,000 years ago or something like that. Now, we also see the small sort of armadillo tortoise-shaped thing on the bottom. That's a glyptodon. And glyptodons are another sort of Ice Age recognizable animal, right? Or Ice Age famous animal. Although some of the earlier relatives, such as what we saw in the Miocene, didn't get quite as big. And we also did have relatives of, or not just relatives, we also had really large armadillos that lived at this time as well. In addition to much bigger versions of modern animals we see today. This sort of large guinea pig looking thing is actually a close relative of guinea pigs. In fact, it's called the guineazilla because it is a cavimorph rodent. So, like I said, related to things like capybaras and guinea pigs that could actually get multiple hundreds of pounds. I believe this animal could grow anywhere from around 300 to 400 pounds up to something like 1,600 pounds. So almost a ton in weight. And it's just really interesting seeing, something like a guinea pig is really closely related to such a large sort of herbivore like we're seeing here. And of course, you also had ground sloths, very small ancestor to some of the more Ice Age famous ground sloths like Orematherium, which, like I said, during the Pliocene and Ice Age, so around 3 million years ago to where they went extinct around 12,000 years ago. Some of these larger genera of ground sloths could get up to 15 feet tall and weigh something like 6 tons. So this is like an elephant-sized sloth. Turns out the sloths that are still around today, the tree-dwelling sloths, are actually the weird ones, right? Because most sloths are actually ground-dwelling, at least if we include all of the fossil sloths, right? So that's kind of interesting how everyone but the weird ones went extinct. And then, of course, just like today, there were also fossil rheas, which is another flightless bird that's again more closely related to things like emus and ostriches. Those are still around today in South America. Up on the top right, you have an anhinga, which is known as a snake bird. And growing up in South Florida, I used to see these guys all the time. These are essentially like diving birds, where they use their sort of long neck to allow them to, in their spear-like beak, to catch fish and swallow them whole. If you guys have cormorants, I think you guys in North Carolina have cormorants. They're relatives of those. And then all the way on the right here, we see another really, really big bird known as Argentavis. And Argentavis is thought to be one of the, not necessarily the heaviest, because they were, proportionally much less dense than something like a terror bird, because again, they have to fly, so they have to be, a little bit lighter in terms of their skeleton composition. But this is one of the largest birds in terms of wingspan. Argentavis is thought to have a wingspan of 21 feet. It's absolutely massive. It's like if you take 3 me's, which, I'm technically 5'11", right? But I'm 5'11" and 3/4. So if you round, it's closer to 6 foot. So I'm going to say I'm 6 foot here. Okay. If you put 3 me's on top of each other, I would still be a few feet short of the wingspan of this animal. This just goes to show how absolutely massive this sort of animal was. And so, yeah, terror birds had a lot of other organisms they either had to prey on or compete with. And so let me see. Why aren't you? There we go. But in terms of like the evolution of the terror birds, the first terror bird, this is kind of up in the air because unfortunately, terror birds already tend to not fossilize fantastically because being a bird, they tend to have quite a bit of holes, or not necessarily holes. They tend to have a lot more spongy bone than mammals do. Mammals still have spongy bone, but overall at a much lower density than birds do. And so, with the sponginess of the bone comes increased surface area, which means that your bones are more likely to decompose and dissolve away. And so most of the really early terror birds that we have, not only do they tend to be fragmentary, but they also tend to look like more, ancestral Karyomorphs, things that are close to being terror birds, but aren't quite. So it's hard to say based off 1 or 2 bones that, oh, this is definitely a terror bird, or this definitely isn't, but it's a close relative, right? So things like Paleocelopterus, which is 50 million years old from Brazil, looking at around 5 feet tall, around 90 pounds, excuse me. And things like, and the Antarctic, quote unquote, forest rocket, which is probably just a Karyomorph, getting around 6 feet, 220 pounds. And Lavocatavis africana from Algeria is around 5 feet tall, 100 pounds. All 3 of these species or these specimens are, sort of we're not able to tell whether or not they're actually forest rockets or not, or whether or not they're just early Karyomorphs that are sort of related to forest rockets, right? That are close relatives to forest rockets. In fact, the earliest definite forest rocket where we have the right bones with the right anatomical features to say, oh, this is definitely a terror bird, is, well, from Argentina around 43 million years ago. And this particular specimen isn't named just because it's still super fragmentary. But, based on the estimations and comparing the size of the bone to, excuse me, comparing the size of the bone to other sorts of terror birds, we can tell that this really early forest rocket from Argentina is, standing about as tall as a Saraema, so around 2.5 feet tall, but is around 10 pounds. So about double the weight, which tells us it's probably going to be a bit more heavily built than, the kinds of Saraemas we're seeing around today. Now, if one of these other sort of, might not be a forest rocket organisms, if we discover more fossils of them and we do find them to be forest rockets, well, then this would have a lot of implications, because a couple of these specimens, and as well as a couple others I didn't mention, were found from places like Europe, Africa, and Antarctica. And while South America wasn't quite as far away from these other continents as it is today, it was still something like, from Africa to South America, it was around an 800-mile journey. I believe it's like double that today. I think it's around 1,600 miles from the closest point between South America and Africa. And so in Antarctica to South America at a time was also, a couple hundred miles. So, these birds are flightless, right? They wouldn't have been able, and even if they could fly similarly to a Saraema, Saraemas can't fly for more than a couple hundred yards. So flying multiple hundreds of miles would be out of the question. And so these organisms probably had one or two strategies if they originated in one of these other non-South American continents. They could have simply island hopped, which just means that there were islands in between these two continents, and they were able to swim a short distance, or got caught in a raft on a storm or something a short distance, would end up on this island, and then the descendants of that animal would go to the next island and then the next island until eventually the terror birds would make it to the mainland, right? They would make it to mainland South America. So that's one way of doing it. Another way is thought to be similar to how things like monkeys were thought to go from Africa to South America, which is essentially, as I mentioned before, something called rafting, in which, during large storms, you can sometimes have large amounts of something like vegetation, something that floats really well, and a lot of trees with all the roots, sort of forming like a pseudo landmass, gets thrown out to sea. And this, for small animals, which would make sense for, like a 10-pound terror bird, are able to ride on these rafts. And, most of the time these animals don't make it anywhere, and in fact just end up getting caught in currents and dying eventually. But sometimes, 1 out of every 1,000 times, they'll make it to another landmass. Okay, and this can be actually combined with island hopping to sort of form, an excellent way for, animals from one continent to make it to another without there being any way or any sort of land bridge, right? And so this is how, if terror birds didn't evolve in South America and they evolved from another continent, this is how we imagine that they would get there. But regardless of, how they ended up in South America, or if they evolved in South America, from this initial terror bird from 43 million years ago, you had a sort of radiation into three main ecological niches, or ecomorphs. The first ecomorph is very similar to the ancestral state, right? A very, a relatively small Saraema-like animal that, again, was about the size of a bald eagle. So standing around 2.5 feet tall to 3 feet tall and being around 11 pounds. And these animals are, thought to, again, be more specialized for smaller prey, like a Saraema. So things like eating things like snakes, lizards, frogs, rodents, stuff like that. And the skull of these animals is, pretty gracile. It's really long and really allows them to sort of pick up smaller prey and things like dense vegetation, stuff like that. And as you can see on this this artwork to the right here, this smaller bird you see with the more long skull with the snake in its mouth, that's what we're imagining, or what we conclude essentially these small mesopredator terror birds to be like. Okay, so more similar in an ecological niche to something like a heron or a raccoon or something like that. Now, on the other side of the size spectrum, okay, we have what we know as the apex predator morph. Okay, and this is similar to what you see on the left end of that picture here, this very, very large bird, in which they, some genus like Paraphysornis, Forus racus, which is what is displayed on this artwork here, and Titanus, they get really large, right? They get to the size of big cats. We're talking 5 to 8 feet tall, okay, and around 500 pounds in weight. And so these right here are more of like your average sizes for this large apex predator. There were some genera, however, who got even larger than this. Kalenkin, for example, is thought to be the tallest terror bird we know of. Right? It's thought to be almost 10 feet tall, and I mean, still absolutely massive in terms of mass. Talking around 600 pounds, right? And so again, this is a terror bird that is essentially the same length and weight as a Siberian tiger. And given that the Siberian tiger is one of the largest terrestrial non-bear predators, or at least terrestrial mammal predators, right? I mean, this is for a bird that's absolutely ridiculous. Considering that the largest bird we have today is an ostrich, which gets around, large males get to like 9 feet tall and weigh, half this weight at around 300 pounds. This is just absolutely would be terrifying if you looked at it face to face. One thing about Kalenkin, however, is that looking at its bones, we know it's really tall, but it seemed to be rather lengthy, right? And this just shows that there's some plasticity in between these morphs, right? Not all of them are going to be the same build. Not all of them are going to, have the same length of legs or anything like that. For 600 pounds for a 10-pound animal is pretty heavy, but there were also some terror birds that were even heavier than the tallest terror bird. Devinsenzia, for example, is a couple feet shorter than Kalenkin, but thought to outweigh it by almost 100 or over 150 pounds, right? And so this sort of lends the idea to even these apex predator probably hunting in slightly different ways. Whereas Kalenkin's a lot more lanky. It's probably existing on the plains or more open habitats, chasing down prey, being a little bit faster. Whereas Devinsenzia is more of a heavily built animal, probably more similar in behavior to something like an ambush predator like a tiger, to where they would be mostly hiding in foliage and then ambushing prey whenever they would get close, right? And this is typically what we see with predators. Usually the more gracile ones are the ones that are running for longer distances, whereas your more thicker, more muscular predators are usually more so ambush predators. And so these guys also had incredibly large skulls, as I mentioned before, with Kalenkin having the largest at around 28 inches long. I mean, that's a bird with this, a skull almost as big as my arm. Okay, so this just goes to show how absolutely massive these animals were. And I was supposed to have one, but I must have left it at my office. So unfortunately, I don't have one to show you guys today. I thought I had it, so I didn't bother to check for it before the talk, but I guess I left it there. So sorry about that. But anyway, getting back on track here, and then there's a third ecomorph that's sort of in between the sizes of these last two, more of a mid-sized ecomorph, more of a sort of generalist. Okay, and so this includes genera like Patagornis and Algornis and Yaowavis, sort of reaching around 3.5 to 5 feet tall and around 40 to 150 pounds in weight. So, more like dog, wolf sized. And they did actually have skull shapes more similar to that of the apex predator morphs. So very thick, very, sort of strong skulls. And so this tells us they would have also, like the apex predator morphs, gone after relatively large prey, comparable to their body size. But, of course, because they're smaller, they're going to go after prey that is smaller than the apex predator morphs. And so here's sort of an artwork that shows a bunch of these different species. This is, there are a couple more species than what's listed here, because again, this is a relatively older artwork. Excuse me. And generally, I think it shows off the heights of everything pretty good. But I definitely think I would have liked to see a little bit more differences in terms of the body proportions. Just because, as I mentioned before, right, there were some terror birds that were a little bit lankier than others, some that were, again, absolute beefcakes. And so, but overall, this is really, really good, right? In terms of the body shape of these animals and everything like that. There is one animal on here called Brontornis, that was for the longest time considered to be among the heaviest of the terror birds. It should actually be a little bit shorter than Kalinkin. But it was estimated to be something like over 800 pounds, right? It was considered to be the beefcake of the terror birds. But over the past 5 to 10 years or so, there's been some studies of the remains, because again, the remains of Brontornis were relatively fragmentary, in which they decided, or they figured out, or determined rather, that it wasn't a terror bird, but a sort of an animal that is more closely related to other large flightless birds like Gastornis, which for those of you who don't know about Gastornis, Gastornis is a large bird that's an herbivore, right? And so this would make sense for an animal that is ridiculously heavy. For when you get too heavy, when you get too beefcake, right? You're gonna have a harder time chasing after prey animals. And so for a bird that's almost 1,000 pounds, being able to chase after prey seems to become a little bit difficult to imagine. And so chances are that Brontornis, like Gastornis, is actually more closely related to things like geese, right? It's an anseriform, where it's essentially a giant herbivore terrestrial goose, essentially, which would still make it very scary for those of you who have experienced geese. A goose that's 2.5 feet tall is, they can be very scary at times. They're very mean. Their bites don't feel very good. And so imagine that, but probably over 15, 20 times the weight, right? It's just that's terrifying in itself, even if it isn't a terror bird. Now, in terms of the hunting style of terror birds, regardless of whether or not they were the ambush predators, or they were more, cursorial, more running after their prey over, long distances. We know that for one, they did have excellent vision. Okay. We might think of ourselves as having fantastic vision, just because, oh yeah, this is, but we can see much better than things like dogs, right? We could see much better than things like, armadillos and raccoons and stuff like that. Whatever other mammals we see really good for mammals. The only thing is mammals don't have great vision in general, and pretty much every bird will have better vision than us, right? In fact, I believe most birds can actually see in more colors. They can see things like infrared, like ultraviolet light, that we cannot see. So not only do they have this sort of wider color spectrum, do they see things in more color than what we see it, they're also known to have better visual acuity. And given the fact that terror birds are, birds, as is the name, right? They are thought to have excellent vision as well. They're thought to have similar visual acuity to their cousins, the falcons. And falcons are considered to have among the best vision in the entire bird class. So this just really goes to show, like, yeah, these animals probably had excellent vision as well. And they probably used this vision to, be able to see and locate their prey over, pretty good distances. But in addition, they also had, really powerful leg muscles. I mean, we're talking about, they were thought to be able to run at speeds that, for the larger specimens, right, something like an ambush predator, like a, Deniscensia, to be able to run around 30 miles an hour, which is similar in speed to something like a brown bear, which, for those of you who have ever, seen a brown bear on TV, or, in real life, hopefully from a safe distance, right? These animals can move incredibly quickly for their size. And so 30 miles an hour for brown bears allows them to catch things like deer, like elk, like moose. And so it's thought that, even for these larger specimens of terror birds, 30, 31 miles an hour would be more than enough to catch their larger prey. For some of the smaller animals, some of the more mid-sized animals that are going after smaller, faster prey, the speed is increased. Mesembryornis, which is what you're seeing on the left here, okay, is thought to have, a great combination of, leg musculature and leg length to allow them to run 60 miles an hour. That is similar in speed, maybe a little bit less than one of the fastest land animals we know of, the African cheetah, right? And so this animal is just running at absolutely incredible speeds. And, considering that it probably preyed on really fast prey, like this fossil rhea that you also see in the artwork with this guy. Yeah, then this would make sense that, these smaller predators, these sort of mid-sized predators, are probably able to run much faster than their larger counterparts, because they're going after smaller, more more quick, agile prey. Now, in addition to these feeds, birds also have a respiratory system that's more efficient than ours, right? And so it's thought to give them much greater endurance. And so I am going to try my best to sort of explain the bird respiratory system, the avian respiratory system a little bit, right? And so birds not only have lungs, of course, right, obviously, but they also have several pairs of air sacs, both towards the posterior of their body, known as posterior air sacs, and anterior air sacs towards the front of their body. And these air sacs allow the storage of both oxygen-rich and oxygen-poor air so that they can always continuously allow a flow of oxygen-rich air into their lungs. So if we were to sort of, take a breath in, for instance, like just take a deep breath in, we're breathing oxygen-rich air into our lungs. It's the only place we have to store it. And then our body will go ahead and metabolize, take up the oxygen, okay, and release CO2, which is a waste product of our metabolism. And then we have to get rid of the CO2. So what do? We breathe it out. But, during this process, we only have oxygen in our lungs for half the time, right? The other half is spent, getting rid of this waste product known as CO2. With birds, essentially, when they take their first breath in, you have oxygen-rich air that goes into these posterior air sacs, okay? So they go ahead and take this first breath in. Whatever was in the lungs then gets pushed into the anterior air sacs. And then during their first exhalation, the oxygen-rich air from the posterior air sacs moves into the lungs, and whatever was in the lungs during the first breath is pushed out, okay? And so essentially, this means that, whenever the animal breathes in, the air sacs are filling up, whether it's oxygen-rich air in the posterior air sacs or CO2-rich air in the anterior air sacs. And so you never really have oxygen-poor air remaining in the lungs for nearly the amount of time that we do. And even if it's, a few milliseconds, it's still significantly faster than what we're getting. And this allows pretty much a constant stream of oxygen-fresh air into the lungs and allows them to, create or sort of to absorb enough oxygen to allow them to do things like flying. And because the ancestors of terror birds were thought to be flighted, they really have no reason to evolve away from this more efficient respiratory system. So this means that, the only the only thing that would be keeping them from running continuously, not continuously, but for, a long period of time, would be if they were to overheat, right? Well, that would be really the only thing, rather than anoxia or a lack of oxygen in the blood. And hopefully I explained that in a way that you guys understand, right? I apologize if it wasn't good. I've always had issues explaining that, but hopefully you guys get it. If not, feel free to ask me about it, at the end of the talk. It's not a problem. And so once, this terror bird, regardless of the size, right? If we're talking like a mid-sized to an apex bird or more, after they locate and they start chasing down their prey and they catch up to it, you would expect them to, maybe bite onto the back of the neck of the animal and just rip a chunk out. Turns out that might not be the case if they were going after prey that was similar to their body size. But there was also another study done on a mid-sized terror bird known as Andalgornis, and it was found that the musculature of the jaw rather, was only thought to be able to produce enough force equivalent to a otter that was, like a sixth of the size, okay? And so what this tells us is that when it came to hunting large prey, they probably weren't just biting, biting in order to kill them. They were, sort of probably doing other sorts of strategies to end up, unaliving whatever prey item they're chasing. Now, of course, there are other large prey specialists that are killing large animals despite a weak bite force. Things like Smilodon, which is probably, if you imagine a saber-toothed cat, it's going to be Smilodon, right? That's the one that has the sort of bobbed tail and the really long canine teeth. But also Allosaurus, which is a sort of a Jurassic-aged, large carnivorous dinosaur. Both these animals, based on similar studies, have shown that they really cannot produce a whole lot of force with their jaw. Excuse me. A second. But instead, they use their powerful neck muscles to actually augment the power of their bite. So instead of just using the muscles that allow their lower jaw to bite, they then use their neck muscles to sort of augment the power of the jaw musculature. Okay, allow them to bite much harder than just simply looking, or than just the amount that their jaw muscles will produce. Now, there is something interesting regarding the skulls of terror birds, and again, I wish I really had that skull. But we'll take a look at a picture of a skull in a second. But what's different regarding terror bird skulls versus like something like a Seraema or something like a bald eagle is that terror bird skulls are very, very tall and they're very, very long, right? And so they're very thick in terms of what we call dorsal ventrally, right? They have a really good height, and they also have a very long skull. So it's generally that's why they have very large skulls, is to allow thickening of bone in both dimensions. However, if you were to look at a terror bird straight on from side to side, it's very thin, right? What we call laterally. So it's very large from top to bottom, dorsal ventrally, and from front to back. Or from side to side, it's very thin. This gives the skull a sort of axe-like shape that allows these animals to withstand a lot of force that would be created from frontal impacts, and from frontal down impacts. Now, what exactly do birds do that produces a lot of force in this direction and in this direction? Well, they peck. And it's thought that because of the shape of their skull, their more axe-shaped skull, that this is how they killed their prey. They would use their massive neck muscles. As you can see here, I mean, this is a 5-foot bird with a neck that's like this thick, okay? And so this produces a bunch of muscles. They have very flexible necks. And so it's thought that, when they would run alongside a large prey item, they would sort of rear their head back and strike the prey in the back of the neck or the back of the skull, essentially acting like a hammer or a hatchet to bust bones, to paralyze the prey, essentially to even either break into the skull of the prey or to break the prey's neck. And then, after the prey animal is either straight up dead or paralyzed, like a Seraema does, with the whole, throwing the snake up in the air and slamming it, they can then just rip it apart at its leisure using this razor sharp beak. And because of the thinness of the skull from side to side, all this power produced by these neck muscles focuses the point of impact on a very small space. Like I said, working exactly like something like a hammer or a pickaxe or a hatchet to just maximize impact on the prey item, whatever it is they're going after. And so for me, this is such a cool way of killing prey animals that is different from, oh yeah, I bite him, it's, I rip a chunk out, it's dead, right? To me, for some reason, I don't know what it is, this just is so just absolutely, like, it just makes me feel so, like, this animal's just so cool, right? I'm nerding out a little bit, right? You guys understand why these are one of my favorite animals now. One of my favorite megafaunal animals, anyway. So anyway, moving on, because I can rant about this guy for this strategy of killing forever. Now, it's also thought that terror birds, as I mentioned before, they do have very powerful legs, so they could also, when in the case of smaller prey items, deliver extremely powerful kicks. And like I said, they were able to. It's thought that within some genus they were able to produce, or some genera, excuse me, they were able to produce force that was equal to 3.5 times their own body weight. So something like Mesembryornis that is around 100 pounds, I mean, they're producing, forces that are 350 to 400 pounds. And so that's enough to break the bones of many smaller ungulates like deer, that when deer, they're not hunting deer themselves, but they're hunting deer-like animals, right? And so it's thought that these sort of kicks would be able to do this sort of damage to smaller prey items, things that are, probably around their size, if not smaller. And then, of course, they also have really long claws, including that raptor claw that we saw with the footprint of terror birds, to really allow them to disembowel prey items or maybe even other competitors, both in their species